further ado, I'd like to introduce Paola Ramos, Symone Saunders, and Natalie Montelongo. Paola Ramos is an author and Emmy Award-winning journalist. She was educated at Barnard College and the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard Kennedy School. She's contributed or written for MSNBC, Telemundo, Vice Magazine, and KCRW. She was the Deputy Director of Hispanic Media for Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign, a political appointee during the Obama administration, and also served in President Obama's 2012 re-election campaign. In 2020, she published her first book, Finding Latinx, In Search of the Voices Redefining Latino Identity. She will be in conversation with Symone Saunders and Natalie Montelongo. Symone Saunders is an author and commentator. She is the co-host of MSNBC's The Weekend and was a political commentator on CNN. Representative Maxine Waters described her first book, No You Shut Up, Speaking Truth to Power and Reclaiming America, as an honest and profound reflection on standing up and speaking out. And I also have to say, if you go to Wikipedia, you will see one of the hardest profile pictures you're ever going to find on that website. So, progressive strategist Natalie Montelongo works in political engagement at Pivotal Ventures with Melinda French Gates. She has worked on campaigns for both Senator Elizabeth Warren and Senator Julian Castro, and assisted in launching national initiatives to harness the power of the Latino vote. I really am very glad that you're all here to celebrate an absolutely fantastic book and enjoy what I'm sure is going to be a very fascinating conversation. So please join me in welcoming Natalie Montelongo, Symone Saunders, and Paola Ramos.
We feel like you should sit over there. Oh my goodness.
First of all, can I say something before you start? We are not supposed to be on time as a crowd, so the fact that we got here on time makes us look bad. But I am sorry for making everyone wait on this extremely.
You all are waiting because of me. I came from the airport. And I was like, go without me, I'm sliding in. She was like, no. Speaking of which, this is just a housekeeping matter. We are going to take some questions. We'll be taking questions, not soliloquies in a little bit, so get ready for that. Also, any staff that's out there at the door, if you could just walk outside of that Mercedes and turn it off, just press the button, it's me. It will not allow me to do so on my phone. Well, let's jump into this. I'm being very serious. License plate 402. Okay. This book, let me just tell you, I was in Springfield, Massachusetts earlier today, not to be confused with Springfield, Ohio. And they were like, oh, can you stay? I said, absolutely not. I have a very tight flight. I'm going to go do a book talk for Paola Ramos. And they said, oh, that book is scary. It is required reading. And I'm like, it is required reading. And yes, some of what's in there is scary, but it's real. Why did you write this real scary book?
Because we should be scared. Okay, so I think you and I, we've talked about this for a long time. I think the first time that I started to think about this idea that something was happening was in 2016. I know so many of us worked in that 2016 Hillary Clinton campaign, and good and bad memories. But I think I was scared about the idea that so much of the theory of change of our campaign was built on this idea that in the face of someone like Donald Trump, when he was coming down the escalator, when he was saying the things that he said, the idea in the story would be, come November, when we would all wake up, that Latinos would be part of the huge story of Secretary Clinton's win. And I believed it. I think a lot of our internal figures said that. And we know the way that ended. No one got jobs. Here we are. But that was part of the sort of delusion as well. I mean, we were thinking about, how are you gonna get? None. And then come November 2020, after 4 years of Trumpism, after seeing family separation, after seeing what everyone sees, someone like Trump still is able to make something gross. We can debate if that is worthy of not, if that's an anomaly or not. And I think in this election we'll understand if what we saw in 2020 was an anomaly or if it's something bigger. But I think the fact that he can still hold anywhere between 35% to 40%, given the things that he's saying, promising mass deportations, it should be scary. And if it's not scary, then I think that's a problem.
I want to step in and also clarify here in my personal capacity.
Yes, sorry. We
Um,
all are, me too.
but I
Be clear. I didn't get this clear, just Candace. Lord up top.
First, I want to shout out this amazing group, and I think like it just shows to Paola's commitment to the community. She's known a lot of the people here in this room for a very long time, so thank you for showing up for her. I also just want to say thank you, Paola, for your commitment to Latinos. Whenever Paola texts me like I'm in my favorite city, I know she means she's in Brownsville, Texas. And I still remember, after the Hillary campaign, how you started documenting your own interviews on your phone that would air in Telemundo, to getting to Vice, to then sometimes anchoring MSNBC, your first book, Finding Latinx, and now this book. It's been amazing to see your journey and commitment to really thinking through our own identity. And so I just, first of all, want to name that. I'm grateful to you. I know there's been a lot of conversation about the shift into Latinos becoming more conservative for a while. But I found your book really intriguing because it's not just talking about Latinos as stats. It really delves into real stories of people that you met in person and followed. So just want to ask an open question about how that journey was for you, how it was meeting those people in person, anything that, that you might have surprised you when you met them and thought, we are from a certain political spectrum, we've worked in democratic politics to elect Democratic candidates, but wondered if they became more human to you when you met them in person.
Yeah, thank you. There's a reason why you are an organizer. Yes, you have your professional hat, but thank you for saying that. I was stepping into rooms and conversations with people that have absolutely nothing in common with me. Perhaps even disavow who I am just purely because I'm gay. Thinking about having conversations with Enrique from the Proud Boys or the Moms for Liberty folks. Thinking about having conversations with Latino Evangelical pastors that are flirting with ideas like Christian nationalism. The list goes on. And so yes, I think so the sort of the entry point for me, regardless if I'm going in as a reporter and I'm not supposed to have biases, but you do. I spent so much time online having ideas of who these men and women are. They appear to be so strong. They say things that I find dangerous. And then somewhere in the middle of those conversations, you understand, if you're able to put the politics to the side, that there are some things in common. For instance, someone like Enrique from the Proud Boys, we grew up miles away from each other. He grew up close to Little Havana. My sister that's here and we spent so much time in we're not friends with him, I'm not trying to say anything. But our ability to talk about parts of Miami, my ability to talk with one of the guys from Gays Against Groomer, who spends all his time really sort of creating this dangerous narrative about kids being indoctrinated. But then him and I having the sort of conversations around why we felt so much shame coming out. He felt so much shame telling his Mexican immigrant family. I took so long to come out to my Mexican side of the family. So sort of those moments happen throughout the book. And then you really realize that everyone, and we were talking about this before, that everyone is kind of, I'm not trying to justify anything, but it's sort of everyone's own journey of belonging. And at times that belonging takes you to extremes. People find power and belonging in the Proud Boys. People find what they're yearning for in some churches. People find that belonging in these groups. But more often than not, the story starts at the same time, in the same way. And it's at some point, they weren't really feeling seen. They weren't really felt like they were part of a community. And they find something. But then what's interesting, and I think of Enrique again, that sort of whatever illusion of power white power gives you is very tenuous, because even someone like Enrique Daria, the moment in November 2020, after he becomes the leader of the Proud Boys and he becomes the leader of Latinos for Trump, when he fails at his job and Trump is not elected, one of the first things that the Proud Boys do, after they sort of use him as a shield, to sort of shield themselves from being criticized as white supremacists. Well, no, we're not, because Enrique Daria is he's an Afro-Latino. We can't be white supremacists. After they use him as that, the first things that they do is they break up with Enrique because Enrique fails. And so Kyle Chapman, one of the leaders of the Proud Boys, says, days after the election, he says, you know what? The West was built by white race and white race alone, and we owe absolutely nothing to any other race. And he breaks up with Enriquetario. Now, Enriquetario is in jail, obviously, but that just shows you, how when you really think about that belonging, it is an open question. Like, did you really belong there? And I think we're all sort of going through that dance.
Along those lines, you explore Christian nationalism in this book, and I think oftentimes when we hear the term evangelical, what pops in my head is white evangelicals. Right. But you write about a pastor that you met, Luis Cabrera, and he is a Christian nationalist, but he is not a white Christian nationalist. And this is what you write about in the book. You say, in 1996, about 65% of Americans identified as Christian and white, and by 2020 that number dropped to 44%. Recruiting exclusively white evangelicals, therefore, is simply not a sustainable strategy. Because Christian nationalism is as much a theological ideology as it is a political strategy, extremist Republicans can't deny the country's demographic shifts and are reluctantly advancing an alternate version of God's plan by reaching out to Latinos in order to achieve their desired political outcome. To survive, the movement needs Latinos and pastors like Luis Cabrera. Talk about that, because evangelicals have been organizing for, decades, even more than 50 years, because when I say evangelical, I think, we often think white Christian nationalists, but Black pastors are evangelicals, right? So there has been an evangelical movement to organize, since the founding of this country. But this particular subset, I believe, is gaining traction in a way in which a lot of the policies that we're talking about now, whether we're talking about Project 2025 or whatnot, it is intrinsically intertwined with a white Christian nationalist movement.
And I want to be clear, the majority of Latino evangelicals are not Christian nationalists. The majority of people of faith are not that. The point is to understand that there is a small but growing segment of Latino evangelicals that are being courted. And so it's interesting to your point to understand why. So even thinking about the 2020 election, where Donald Trump launches his Evangelicals for Trump. In 2020, he doesn't launch Evangelicals for Trump in West Virginia or Pennsylvania or Ohio. He specifically goes to Miami-Dade County. And because he understands, and they have understood, Republicans have understood really well, that in order for sort of Christianity to survive, and iterations of Christian nationalism to survive, and in order for Trumpism to survive, they're seeing an opportunity within Latino evangelicals, within these churches. And to your point, it's such a different audience. So when you think of white Christian evangelicals and Latino evangelicals, even just the numbers, most Latino evangelicals right now are first and second generation immigrants. They're Spanish speakers. I think for the last 15, 20 years, they come to this country, and the first thing that I always ask the people that I interview is, what's the first thing you do when you come to this country? More often than not, we find a church. Because churches obviously offer a place of refuge. It's a safe space. It offers you a sort of shield from the politics and the nastiness. And I think traditionally, it's been incredible, for so many sort of asylum seekers and migrants and first and second generation Americans to find those places. And now we are where we are, where Republicans have understood that if you mix MAGA and faith, it can really politicize people. And so many of those inroads that Donald Trump made in 2020, part of that was the Latino evangelical sort of voting bloc that saw something in him. And those pastors have a lot of power. They're charismatic leaders. I remember during COVID asking some people that were going to these churches, I said, who do you listen to as you're trying to seek information? And more often than not, it was the pastors. Someone like Rosario that I interviewed in California, she was like, why would I listen to Dr. Fauci? I don't know who Dr. Fauci is. But I listen to my pastor, and my pastor is telling me not to get the vaccine. And so that just shows you sort of the power that's there. And then you zoom into some of the numbers, and you see that right now, over 50% of over 50% of Latino evangelicals right now believe in a form of Christian nationalism. And so there's something also interesting if you keep digging in to understand where that comes from. We're talking about a community that carries so many legacies of sort of the doctrine of discovery, being sort of institutionalized, this idea of Catholicism that is part of a form of government. We carry with us years and years of American evangelical missions across Latin America. So the idea of the way that church and state, those lines have been blurred for decades, for years. And so you come to this country and it's more familiar than not, when someone is really crossing and blurring those lines.
I was able to meet up with Paola a little bit before this, and I just had way more questions about after reading the book. And so one of the questions for me was, you structure your book around three main themes: tribalism, traditionalism, and trauma, as a way to explain how people are trying to identify themselves or make sense of their identity here. But a theme that I also noticed is how some of these leaders, for example, like Monica Cruz, who ran as an anti-immigrant, reformist in South Texas, or actually Luis Cabrera, who's trying to make America godly again, how they're using potentially fear as a way to gain political power, personal power. And we've seen this happen a lot, especially in some of these mega churches, where you gain power by making people afraid of being, not part of something. And so my question actually to Paola was do these people actually believe they're bullshit? Are they believing, do they actually believe, are they misleading people because they felt how power feels and they like it? Or are they themselves misled?
I think it's both. And I think we can all sort of have different examples of that, but I do think it's both. And I think, of course, there's something, when they sort of find you and they tokenize you as the only Latino MAGA sort of leader, and you're finally sort of at the top of power within white folks, that's powerful. That's to your head. And that's the story of Enrique and March for Liberty and everyone that has sort of gone up the ladders of those hierarchies. Suddenly you go from being in the floor to being all the way at the top, and that's powerful. But I do think that so much of sort of the elements that I talk about in the book, which is sort of the internalized racism, the weight of colonialism, the political trauma, I do think it's deeper than the politics of it all. I think all those elements culminate into a section of Latinos that do, I believe, truly believe in these things. You mentioned Monica de la Cruz. Monica de la Cruz is, she's in the 15th Congressional District in Texas. Part of her campaign was around the Great Replacement theory. Part of her message was build the wall. Donald Trump supported her during the midterm elections, and I do think she believes that. And maybe part of that is also that our perception of who we are is also maybe flawed. Maybe Monica de la Cruz sees herself more aligned with the vision that Trumpism is offering. And that is also okay. It's uncomfortable to think about that. But I think it's better to confront, and I think that's kind of what we're staring at. It's like a community that's staring at two visions. We have always been told that we belong here, that we have this sort of allegiance to each other, that we have this form of solidarity, and that made sense for many years. But maybe, I think what's being questioned is, was the sort of Latinidad of it all, was that socially fabricated? And I don't know. I believe that we still have more in common, but I think what we're seeing is some people that are staring at sort of these two visions and finding sort of a new political home in Trumpism. And maybe it's driven by fear, but I think it's deeper. I know you disagree.
We know you disagree. We just want to be on the record. Don't tell them off of that. Look, I just think about, obviously, I spent, just like you all, a lot of time in organizing, and as a strategist, not like saying I'm a recovering strategist, I play one on TV. And what always shocked me about people that don't do organizing work, right, but they exist in some kind of ethos connected to electoral politics, is when people are doing something or saying something that you don't think they should be saying, that they don't agree with, right? Right about now, the people who are, I'm not talking about these mythical undecided, the mythical white working class voter that is undecided, just don't know, that's actually not who's undecided, but that's another panel. But base Democratic voters right now, Black folks, Latinos, Hispanics, who are saying, I just don't know, I don't know if I'm going to vote. Not that they're considering Donald Trump, but they're just saying they don't know if they're going to participate. And the immediate reaction from people is to shame people about what they're doing. And I think it's very easy, particularly for the folks that you write about in this book, the angle that you take. There are many people that want to shame folks. How could any marginalized group of people, how could they go to Trumpism? This is crazy. But you seek to understand. I'm just wondering, when you came to the point that you said, okay, I need to go investigate this and write about it, because we need to understand, like, what prompted you to go and do that?
I think it's so much easier to see that, or to see these sort of Latino MAGA supporters and say, wow, they're just racist, or it's just an anomaly. And they're all just Christian nationalists. I think that's lazy. I think that's very lazy. And I actually think that does a disservice to who we are. I think we need a lot of curiosity. I think that 40% of Latino voters, I think a lot of Democrats see that as a success, because what people will run with is the surface story, which is the vice president has the Latino vote locked, we're good, and we see that all the time. But I think it does a disservice, and I think it's lazy to just see that as a one-up or as an anomaly. I think if you take the curiosity, you understand that it goes beyond politics. It has so much to do with and I learned so much writing this book about myself, about the way that I identified, or really how we tiptoed around colorism, and even
what's the biggest thing you learned about yourself?
So even, we were talking about it, like even having terms to make sense of some of our behaviors and voting patterns. Why I was even thinking, like, when I introduced some Latinos or Mexican American, and we were just saying, at the beginning, I didn't think of anything when people would be like, well, no, I'm a Spaniard first. I'm Spanish, don't call me a Mexican American. And I would just sort of leave and not make a big deal about it. I remember the first time I really heard it was in Uvalde, when I was covering the tragedy in Uvalde, and so many people would be like, I'm a Spaniard. And I was like, you're Mexican. And then I didn't think But even something like that, talking to historians and scholars that taught me about this idea of like fantasy heritage. I was like, what is fantasy heritage? And then like digging in with them and helping people make sense of the things that at times in politics we're sort of blinded by, So fantasy heritage, even that term, this idea that there's a tendency among us to whitewash our origin story, and to really romanticize the Spanish version of our story, to lead in with the Hispanic first and Latino second, to give that a lot of weight. I never really thought about, when I would, be reporting around there. My mom is Cuban, my dad is Mexican. I grew up in Spain with my mom. We grew up in Spain with my mom. And I have a very thick Spanish accent that never goes away. And so even for years when I've been reporting, no matter where I am, people would stop me and be like, wow, your accent is so much better than mine. I wish, these are like Salvadorians, Guatemalans, like, I wish I could speak like you. But that's fantasy heritage, And that then requires us, and required me to dig deeper into the basics of our history that I just never really think about when I'm covering politics. How did the Spaniards institutionalize a caste system that gave place to the sort of illusion that Latin America is a raceless society, that gave us all the permission to always draw a direct line to the Spanish colonizers? How does that sort of manifest in today's politics? All the time. And so, I nerd out. And I learned a lot.
We were also talking before this about a little bit more about that history, because I experienced this too when I organized in Colorado, where it was the first time that I heard people call themselves Spanish. And I was like, you're straight up Mexican.
Not y'all coming in tough.
But when you dig a little deeper, you also have to consider the history of Latinos in this country, and how not too long ago there used to be signs that said no Mexicans or dogs allowed in this establishment. And so to familiarize yourself more with your Spanish ancestry was actually protection. For some families where they were like, I want my kids to be safe, and so actually the ones who could be right passing, were just like taught to say that. But something interesting that I also was talking with Paola about was how, I think that's also tribalism, what you talk about, how you identify yourself. In South Texas, I told her, like, yeah, only the fresas try to pretend like they're from Spain, like my grandmother's from Spain, and we're like, yeah, okay. But everyone has kind of different experiences based on who it actually has power, how you build power, how the community builds power. in that area. I think about like San Antonio and Rosie Castro, Julian Castro's mom, who ran the first, Chicanos por la Causa campaign with like a first slate of Latinos for city council for representation. So that city actually called themselves Chicanos. And they have so much pride in who they are. They were raised to be taught to be that way. And so I just, a question that I have for you is, did you find that some of these themes, came up more in regionally as you talk to people, how people show up in themselves, whether it's like in the border, how they identify themselves, or in Colorado, how they think of themselves as Spanish?
Yeah, like even sticking with this idea of like fantasy heritage, and I think that comes up all the time at the border, and it's always this idea of Latinos sort of building their identity vis-a-vis the new people, the neo-asylum seekers. And then I think of that same sort of pattern, how that even manifests in a place like the Bronx, and having conversations about identity with even like some Black Latinos, and having sort of back and forth where even when you ask the question, how do you identify? Typically it's I'm Hispanic. And I remember in one instance in the book I write about this, I'm in a hair salon and I'm talking to a Black Dominican woman who's a Trump supporter, obsessed with Trump. And when you dig into the why, it's not just because of sort of, what Trump represents, but it was particularly the way that Donald Trump made her feel safe around Black people. The way that he criminalized Black Lives Matter made her feel that he would sort of protect her from them. And she kept saying, ellos, ellos, ellos. And when you dig into and I was like, who are you talking about? Who's them? ¿Quiénes son ellos? She would say, los morenos, them, the Black people. And then I was like, well, how do you identify? What's your race? And she would keep saying Hispanic. And then her friends were like, it is not. It's like,
Dominicans are Black people. I don't care what anybody else. See, Black people, whether y'all want to be claimed or not. Sorry.
But even that, and then it makes sense, why Donald Trump would feel so comfortable walking into the Bronx and saying what he said, because for some Latinos and some Afro-Latinos, he does tap into a racial and ethnic grievance that resonates. And again, even in the book, I learned so much about even Puerto Rico. So in the 18th century, the Spanish colonizers essentially allowed racially mixed individuals to pay a tax, to pay money, and give them the permission to change their race into white. So you just have to pay the Spaniards money, and you can change your race. And so this idea of reclassifying race and being super elastic with who we are is part of us. And then you look into some of the work that University of Wisconsin students did, and they found that in 1910, there were over 100,000 Black Puerto Ricans. And then by 1920, those same folks had officially changed their race in the census to being white. And so that idea of playing with race, we get away with it in a way that you can't get away with it.
And no, true, but this is, also, Puerto Ricans are Black people too. Yeah, we're claiming the Puerto Ricans. They may not be claiming us, but we're taking it. This is just such a fascinating read, and I think such a timely book, because when Donald Trump went to the Bronx, I'll use that example, the people on TV and in the major newspapers, not us, but everybody else, the crowd was mostly white. And I'm like, did you look at the crowd? The crowd was, maybe y'all think these Latinos are white people, but I saw people of color who saw something in the message. But I think the coverage oftentimes in some of our mainstream outlets misses this nuance. And this nuance is important to understanding what is going on, to therefore, be able to adequately write stories and analyze for people who are reading and watching and listening about what is actually going on in this election. This is this.
For sure, and thanks to you, it doesn't happen, and there's so many incredible journalists in this room. There's Sabrina, there's Jesús, it takes, this room is full of people that are trying to be nuanced about it, and so it takes all of us.
I think we are going to take some questions, but I want to end on a high note and point back to Texas. So Texas is now a majority minority state. It's a state that has the most people turning 18, the second state, the largest state, people turning 18 per year. And so for me, this book also is good because it's a warning sign of what we're leaving at the table as Democrats. And so I have a lot of optimism for people to kind of take action, start organizing more in these communities in a more effective way, meeting them where they are, not judging them. But what hope do you have for young people coming into this political space?
No, I mean, I know we talk so much about the scary of it all, but it's not scary. You know, the scary part is just, it's only scary if we don't talk about it, we don't really break it down. And when you do it, like I said, it's less about Trump, and it's just more about us understanding like what is so uncomfortable about this. It's not that scary. So we've been talking about the one side of the story. The other side of the story is the more interesting one almost, no? Which is not part of this, but it is the way that
It's gonna be your next book.
it's gonna no. This is oh, first an election. Let me do another book. No. But the other side of the story is that we are so young, we're so diverse, and this young generation of Latinos, the millennials, the Gen Zers, and I feel like they are leaning into who they are with a lot more pride and force, perhaps, than like the older generations. And I think sometimes we mischaracterize what's happened, as sort of them not voting for the Democrats, but perhaps it's a good thing. They want to challenge parties more. They expect more. They want to be courted more. And I think we're starting to see some changes. Even this idea that Democrats and Republicans started knocking on Latinos' doors, finally, a year and a half before the election, like, that's a good thing. And I think that comes from this new sort of iteration of Latinos that is demanding more. So that makes me hopeful.
Yes, hope. Give it up for hopeful. Okay, Defectors, the rise of the Latino power rise and what it means for America. We're going to take some questions, not soliloquy, say with me, people. We're going to take not. Oh yes, come on now. And then,
You both are also in the mic, so take advantage.
So y'all have talked a lot about race and ethnicity in this, and I think that's a huge issue, but I also hypothesize there's something with patriarchy and gender here, so I'm curious about like how that came up in your conversation.
A lot, no, so I spend a lot of, so the race and we just talked about that sort of the one pillar, that I talked about tribalism. And I spent a lot of time talking about like traditionalism. And what's interesting, really quickly, like if you even look at the polls right now, the latest one that the Emily just did, it shows you that when you ask Latinos on both sides of the aisle, who's a better leader? Overwhelmingly, the margins are so big, and they'll say Kamala Harris. And then now suddenly when you say which party best represents your values, those margins now for the first time in like a year, they're starting to shrink. And so that just for context. The way that gender comes up, the way that I saw it from up close is particularly around the issue of transgender folks. Now that seems to be this deep moral breaking point for a lot of Latinos. Sort of they dehumanize the abortion issue, they dehumanize perhaps what's happening at the border, but the way that they can't really wrap their mind around trans people and LGBTQ people. And I think because that does invoke a discomfort, in the face of these sort of changing gender norms, changing gender dynamics, changing sexual norms, in the face of that change, there's some people that are deeply uncomfortable by that, that really resonate with Trump's normalcy and going back to that. And that comes up all the time. And I think, again, it's deeper than the politics. It invokes these sort of familiar patterns from the past. But that specific issue, the transgender issue, that Republicans have really capitalized on that. That's how I see it very clearly all the time.
Thank you for this book. And I do want to just, as a Black Latino, I'm so proud to be in a space where we can have all of our values here shared. But the one thing about belonging, that's so fascinating to me that you use that to kind of drive to the framework of this book. Because I think what's really important
is as long as we look to belong to external factors, to things outside of our own selves, and as a Black Latina, the values of dignity and compassion and the things that we are innately built wired with, that we are going to have fear and we're going to have hatred and all the things. It's so easy when you're reaching to fit in outside. So I want to thank you, but the thing that I thought about when I was reading that chapter as a Black Latina, I think about people who came over that Pettus Bridge back in 1950s, 1960, and the dignity and the way in which they walked through. They knew they belonged. You didn't have to tell them, it was in them. They believed in, they walked through. And I think for me right now, this is my Pettus Bridge, heading through this next few weeks. So thank you for the wonderful.
Mom is the only person I'm letting give us a little bit. She earned that.
What advice would you give Latinos or anyone that is looking to vote for a third-party candidate instead of Harris or Trump?
I've been outside of politics for a while, so.
You got clients? What you tell them?
But who's third party now?
Well, no.
Cornell what? Just
She's on the ballot.
in some places. Look, let me just tell you, I'll answer. Okay? Look, people who would like to, I completely understand the just disillusionment with the two-party system. You know, I think that there could be a third party, and I think if people want a viable third party, they should do the work to build one from the ground up in midterm elections and in local elections, not just every 4 years. Because that is in fact not sustainable, and that parties are not built from the top down. So, because nobody's done that work, okay, not even Andrew Yang, he done amended what he thought he was doing. Because nobody's done that work, there are only actually two viable options, okay? So people can vote for Vice President Kamala Harris, so they can vote for Donald Trump, or they could not vote, or they could vote for a third party. But to be very clear, voting for a third party, traditionally, I don't care what the people that I was in the school, I tell not on my show, but in random shows, on TV say, a third party vote has only ever, in recent history, hurt the Democratic candidate. Okay, so if you are like, I don't like either, this is gonna be terrible to say, but you are better off not voting at the top of the ticket than voting for a third party. Because voting for a third party actually does, it is truly a vote for Donald Trump. Last part I would just say is that people do have the power. I fundamentally believe that. I was the only person that decided to go work inside campaigns and government because I believe people have the power. And so, if you are disillusioned with the system and what the people are saying and doing, your vote showing up at the ballot box is one of the many tools in the toolbox of our democracy, but it's a tool that if you use, they pay attention. They are paying attention to Latino voters right now, to what Black men and Latino men are doing, even what Black women are saying, what they may or may not do at the ballot box because of what they're saying and how they voted. And so not participating, nobody will pay attention to you.
I'll say something also super quickly. At the same time, I understand that. At the same time, I do wonder, it's kind of like the theories of change, no? And if in the long term, that'll sort of lead to and really mold the Democratic Party in the way that it should be, you know? Maybe this backlash, if that is in fact, if there's enough people that won't vote for them, and will that message be strong enough to actually make them change the direction? And I think that's also, it's kind of each people's theory of change. And so I also understand, I'm pragmatic, you know, so this is how I see it. I also understand that people's theory of change and the way that they, at times you need to push people a lot. Sometimes that entails pain for them, you know? And so I also get that part of it. And yeah.
Remember when you didn't agree earlier? I didn't agree this time.
Okay, I could just say one more thing.
And then can we do a question for you and then a question from the back?
If you're trying to convince them to vote for like the Democratic Party, for example, I would just remind them that the stakes can be higher and the polls are so close And so I feel like sometimes people want to vote third party because they don't align perfectly well to either candidate. But I think right now we should focus on which party you kind of align with and then become more involved to help that party change in the future. But right now, I would remind them that every single county will come down to just a few votes. Like if you want to feel empowered, like now is the time your vote will absolutely matter everywhere you are. So I would just remind them of the high stakes. The polls haven't changed. It's 50-50 nationally and in every single battleground state. And it's going to come down to just a few votes, and that could be your friend.
Hi. So I actually grew up in Miami. I went to FIU too. And like one of the big things that we talked about today was colorism, but also colorism from the own community. Like I grew up around a lot of Cubans, and one of the things that I got growing up was, oh, like you're Mexican, right? I'm like, no, like I'm Salvadoran. Like there's big communities, like but can you talk a bit about how like colorism within the community and the impact that it has in the views in politics as well?
I mean, I also grew up in Miami, and for many years of my life, I believed that all Cubans looked like me, that we're all light-skinned Cubans. And so the idea that Black Cubans existed in our sort of privileged Cuban bubble was always erased. No? The idea, even thinking about the fact that, of course, there were over 11 million enslaved people in Latin America, that is part of our history, you know? And the rate of Afro-Latinos throughout the continent is immense, no? And we're part of the same community, but that was never part of my sort of orbit. And so I think even a lot of the numbers show that the sort of colorism that exists is equally within us and outside. And I also think about the idea of, like, you bring up Florida, like when DeSantis decides to ship migrants from the border to Martha's Vineyard, the people that most supported that were newly arrived asylum seekers. And so I say this all the time, just because we are Latino or we are descendants of immigrants or immigrants does not make us at all immune to any of the sort of racism and xenophobia. And to know our history is to understand that colorism is intrinsically part of who we are, you know? Because that's been erasing other races is part of sort of the fabric of what the Spanish colonizers did, and sort of that carries on where we are, particularly in a place like Florida. So I'm sorry. I definitely saw that one up close.
Hi, Paola, I really look up to you as, not only as a queer Latina, but as a queer Latina in journalism. And I wanted to ask, what do you think the LGBT community's takeaways are from the book? What do we have to look forward to, and what lessons do we have to learn?
Well, I mean, the lessons. Look, the lesson is that we need more of us, no, doing this. I say this all the time, not just because Lori Montenegro is in the house. So representing Telemundo, but Lori is a perfect example, and so many people in this room of why it's so important to normalize the diversity of our community. You know? Lori Montenegro, Lia Calderon, like that is the beauty of being a Latino, not showing up fully for who we are. But I don't say this at all about you, Lori. I say this about myself because I remember and I say this story all the time. The first time I did Telemundo ever, yeah, I say this all the time. But the first time I did it, the way that the makeup artist sort of made me look was according to the image of like a straight Latina that was like from a telenovela. Like, and I remember just rolling with it because I was like molding to the image that they wanted me to be part of, you know? And I remember like going through the makeup and looking at myself and being like, like a drag queen, like crazy. I love drag queens, but like I didn't. I wish I could have looked better. And so I just remember like doing that hit, and like my mom and I were like, never again, never conform to the image that they want you to conform towards. Never speak like they want you to speak. Never sort of tiptoe around certain issues. And ever since that day, this is what you get. Yeah, but she does tell me to comb my hair. The hair has a life of its own, so I can't be too bad. But you are. You're right. So that's a little anecdote for you, just to show up always. And it's important to normalize it. Yeah.
Good evening. I'm Adrian Williams. I'm a public school teacher. Thank you so much for having me.
One for the teacher!
And I'm actually from New York, so thank you so much for having me. So I'm glad to finally meet the presence of Symone. She's great. So you look great, by the way.
I did this in the car, so thank you.
So, being a public school teacher, and of course I teach many cultures, what wisdom can you share as I teach multiple cultures, but some cultures feel slighted by their culture being used to use basically against other cultures? I can get more granular if you want. I've spoken to several Hispanic, Spanish, Latino, and Mexican who and simply said, well, how do you feel about what's going on? And they have said, specifically students, I teach high school, it's not fair because my family had to come here and work. These people are being given. I'm sitting there. I said, well, I didn't get a free pass. I wasn't called the Mayflower either, but I wasn't given a free pass to be here. How would you suggest me navigating those conversations? Because, of course, children today, unlike myself, when we're in high school, we say, you see but don't talk. They see, they talk, they deliberate, things of that nature.
It's interesting you say that because a teacher, I was speaking at the Bronx 2 days ago, and I had a public school teacher, and she literally said the same thing that we're saying right now, that she was teaching Latino kids that were regurgitating what their parents were telling them, and specifically along the lines of, why are they here? And what are they doing here? And then it's interesting, then I was in Arizona 3 weeks ago, and the conversations that I was having there with teachers and with leaders were how afraid so many children are of the idea of their parents being deported once again, and how literally that trauma is
So coupled with that, I'm talking about African American kids and Latino kids, right? So no one's a monolithic. Right? No environment. So I'm now dealing with children. So as I speak multiple languages, I'm a proud graduate of the Harvard School. There are kids who don't know what that life is, but they see that life even further apart because their families are being given free passes, if you will, metro cards, food stamps, things of that nature, where other people have to fight or live or die for. And then those people that are coming, shall I say, those people are being abusive to the powers that are here, which, we do all.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're up against what so many of us are also up against, like as journalists, no? And it's grounding people in the facts, no? Getting rid of the stereotypes, depoliticizing things, and so it goes. Your job and my job right now is to humanize the numbers and to humanize the insults, and there's no one more important to do that than you. And so I know it's not a fancy answer, but it's like everything is so toxic now. I mean, they go home and they're watching TV and they're doing this and that. But like our job now, and that's our job every day, is like humanizing all of these things that we're watching out there and grounding people back to earth in facts. And that's all I would offer.
Yeah, I'm a journalist as well. I think her book actually breaks this down really well when she talks about tribalism and just the feeling of belonging somewhere. And I think going back to the conversation of calling yourself Hispanic or Latino or Chicano, for a lot of people they call themselves Hispanic to make sure that they identify as someone who has been in this country longer than an immigrant. And so when you break that down, that also means that they're trying to build themselves at a higher level in the racial hierarchy. And so I think what she said about humanizing is the right approach. It's like when you start considering what they are trying to do, trying to identify where they are in the racial hierarchy, talking down about others while building themselves up, I think they're just trying to identify who they are. And I think like the teaching of we're all the same is very simple and very important, but like considering why they're doing that is also, I think, really important, and she does that in this book really well.
Recognizing people's identity, how they identify is an important part of how they choose and how they show up in the world.
I'm her publicist now.
We have one back here, we got the mic.
The C's pardon. So as you know, the Latino Evangelical Church is the fastest growing denomination and faith community in the country, and will soon overtake white evangelicals as the predominant faith community. However, Democrats, liberals, progressives overwhelmingly have disengaged from faith mobilization, faith engagement, where Republicans have done deep engagement with Latino evangelicals for a long time now. Knowing that this is a room full of both journalists and political operators, what advice might you give, right, as we are 32 days and 8 hours from election, to engage more deeply with a community that is becoming the predominant voice in Latino mobilization?
I mean, you probably have a better answer than me, but I'll just tell you anecdotally, like even at the DNC when we were there, one of the things that really caught my attention was for the first time I had ever seen Evangelicals for Harris. And I got her number and I asked her, like, what is your approach? And definitely they knew that it's a very uphill battle, and because they've seen the way that, I mean, really, right, like Republicans have really been making inroads for years at this point. But she said that the message was really simple for her, that actually she was deciding to lean into, and again, I mean, let's see how it works, but when she's from Wisconsin, and that when she's having conversations, she's trying to remind the community of their immigrant roots, you know, and what makes them, at their core, empathetic, compassionate people. And that was her sort of entry point into the conversation. So I think at a time when the country started trying to shift away from that rhetoric at a national level, when we have been dehumanizing this immigrant past for so long, her approach is to bring it back to that. And I think it makes a lot of sense. I think that's part of the problem now, you know, that we've sort of distanced ourselves from that. So that's what I had learned from her.
I think it'll be our last question.
Hi, Paola. Great seeing you again. One of the questions is completely organizing the world. And as the polls are becoming, more equal, there's a lot of political operators in this room. For campaigns moving forward, what advice would you give future campaigns on how to organize Latino communities, as we're not a monolith, but also we're very diverse as a community and with diverse opinions? Because moving forward, Democrats don't have Latino votes as they used to. So what advice would you give a future campaign operative or a campaign moving forward?
We can ping pong for this one.
First of all, I think Democrats need to hire more, treat, just how for the organizers, the campaign people in the room, think about digital and how digital operations for a very long time were just rolled in under the comms team. And then about, I would argue, maybe 3 cycles ago, digital started getting its own vertical, and now the digital director is right up there as a senior member of the campaign, because Democrats and Republicans across the board realize that you cannot effectively campaign in this current environment without literally having your digital operations embedded in a strategy throughout. I think that Democrats specifically need to think about that in terms of Latino and Hispanic voters, as well as Black voters and young people. The constituency operations are just tucked up under one the political director, and then there's all these sub-communities, and it's like they never get into the room with the candidate until it's time to go to, BET or Essence Fest, where you're doing a telemundo interview, and then you bring them in at the end, not the front, where y'all did the Q&A. So I think that it is very important that if Democrats would like to see, and Republicans frankly too, but if campaigns want to see gains with these communities, then you do have to treat the communities like the organizing vertical and the with the importance that it frankly it demands. And that only happens when you build out departments and you elevate the leadership of these particular entities, just like campaigns have done with the digital operations.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so hard, right? Because you have these two campaigns that are treating their messaging so differently because their theory is based on two completely different strategies, right? Like the Trump campaign is convinced about the idea that a segment of Latinos are so Americanized and assimilated that they should be treated as everyone else. And that's the way to really inject the nativism into it, because they are as American as everyone else. And then you have the Hillary campaign that's, I think, being very thoughtful about understanding the regional and ethnic sort of nuances. If they're going to Pennsylvania, they know what surrogate will work there. If they're going to Arizona. I think a combination, obviously taking out the anti-immigrant so that Trump is doing, but I think a combination of that works at this point. And even as you're saying things like, but then Telemundo interviews of this, I mean, I remember in the 2016 campaign, even when we were thinking of doing interviews with Univision and Telemundo, it was always an afterthought. And when it was an afterthought, it was always, you were lucky if they got 10, 15 minutes. And at times it was, I'll never forget, at times it was, sometimes even like surrogates, the interviews would be done standing, and not even taking the time to like sit down. So care is very important, the intention is very important, and I'm not saying anything no one knows here.
So one of my English professors taught me, like, kids, keep it simple, stupid. And literally keep it simple. Like, I don't know why people are breaking their heads. It's just like long-term early investments and long-term investments in communities of color will pay off. And that doesn't mean parachuting in, and that doesn't mean buying ads like the last 2 months. And we've seen case studies of that, like in states like Colorado, for example, that used to be a battleground state and now is kind of like a blue wall. Nevada is another perfect example. Battleground states. Arizona, we flipped it. Georgia, we flipped it. All of those states have been having continual investments since Obama. And so now we're reaping the benefits, but we can't keep our eye off of them. So Nevada, for example, people are now very focused suddenly in the Midwestern states. They're all about Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And I personally am very worried about Arizona, Nevada. And because we are seeing also that the VP is kind of still not polling above the Senate candidate. And so for me, it's all about continued investments. Something that we can talk about is I've seen this change. The shift in South Texas to become more conservative has been also extremely intentional by the Koch brothers. They've been investing in my home district for decades. Building community services, helping them get IDs, like radicalizing them very secretly and very quietly, but they've been consistently organizing these communities. And so that's what really bothers me when people are like, the Latino vote never shows up, I'm like, there's never long-term investments. But we've seen the reap of benefits in all of these other states that have flipped. The other thing I will say, unfortunately, it does have a lot to do with your candidate and their message. For low propensity voters, and I use this as a case study in South Texas, in the Republican primary, overwhelmingly, Donald Trump won. In the Democratic primary, overwhelmingly in South Texas, Bernie Sanders won. It's the same message. It's populism. And it's something that I like now that Harris has been using and integrating a lot more. And so the candidate has to have a spark, for sure. And they have to be delivering the right message, for sure. And then I'll end with this. Something that I really love about the Harris campaign right now is that for a long time, the way that we would talk to Latinos was to caricature them. We would do Spanglish ads in like English and Spanish, or talk about La Chancla, or talk about, because that's how we were like, oh, Latinos in the US, that's how they talk. People on the border, that's how they talk. And those were ads that I would not feel comfortable showing my dad, who's an only Spanish speaker. And so the ads that the Harris campaign has been pushing out are amazing. For me, they're all in Spanish. They're made just like you would make an ad for a person running for president in Mexico, for example, with respect, giving you the right information clearly. Like, that's an ad that I'm proud to show my dad. And so I think that we're learning lessons, but we can't forget the very simple thing. long-term investments, early investments and long-term investments.
That's why she's here.
Can we just clap it up? This is so amazing. I think we're gonna find some books, maybe. But thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it. Tell your friends to buy the book. We want to be your Times bestseller on our hands, folks. Thank you so much.